Hey, people are starting to enter the room now. Thank you very much for tuning in. Welcome to Litquake's Epicenter, which is our virtual series for this spring and summer, produced by Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival. I'm Jack Bulwer from Litquake, and we are streaming live from the Bay Area and throughout the world. Why not say that? Because it is true. Our festival this year will take place October 7th through the 23rd in various virtual and hopefully real life locations. And you can get all the details at litquake.org. Tonight, we are very honored to be able to present the launch event for the new book by Gabriela Garcia, her novel Of Women and Salt. She is also joined tonight by Melissa Rivero, an acclaimed author in her own right, who is generously tuning in to help us facilitate. Of Women and Salt just landed, I am told, this week on the New York Times bestseller list. And it just came out yesterday. It's amazing. So this new novel, published by Flatiron Books, is Gabriela's highly anticipated debut novel, and it centers on 5 generations of women from 19th century cigar factories in Cuba to Mexico to present-day ICE detention centers in the United States. As I mentioned, the reaction to this book has been universal high praise all around. It's just so gratifying to see. New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, Good Morning America, LitHub and beyond. None other than Roxane Gay has said about this book, Gabriela Garcia captures the lives of Cuban women in a world to which they refuse to surrender, and she does so with precision and generosity and beauty. Amazing. Many thanks to Carr and everyone at Green Apple Books for co-presenting this event. You can actually buy Gabriela's signed copies of her book directly from Green Apple Books at their locations in San Francisco. There's also a link in the area and the chat area here down at the bottom. And so please reserve your signed copy today. A few things before we begin. Please feel free to ask both folks a question here using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. After the event, you will be asked to fill out a short survey. These surveys are essential to our efforts to keep these types of programs free to the public. Please don't forget to follow Litquake on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for the latest updates. We are not out of the pandemic yet, even though some of us may have had shots. And so we are grateful for your support of the Litquake organization to allow us to continue to bring these events. The Bay Area was already a precarious place for artists and nonprofits. And we are now in the midst of rebuilding our communities. If you believe in keeping literature a key component of the Bay Area landscape, please consider dropping us a few coins. Every bit helps. We accept donations on Venmo, at Litquake, or PayPal, or directly at litquake.org. So let's get on with it. First of all, our special guest tonight, Melissa Rivero, is the author of The Affairs of the Falcons. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Great, okay. Which has received numerous awards, including a 2020 International Latino Book Award. She was born in Lima, Peru, and is a graduate of NYU and Brooklyn Law School. And she is beaming to us live from her home right now in Brooklyn, New York. And finally, Gabriela Garcia is author of the novel Of Women and Salt, of course. Her fiction and poems have appeared in many outlets, including Best American Poetry, Tin House, Ziziva, and elsewhere. She has received many awards, residencies, and fellowships from Breadloaf, Lighthouse Works, and the Community of Writers at Squaw Valley. She has an MFA in fiction from Purdue University, where she also taught creative writing. Gabriela is the daughter of immigrants from Cuba and Mexico. She was raised in Miami and currently lives right here in the Bay Area. So please welcome Melissa and Gabriela.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Litquake, for hosting Gabriela and for the opportunity to interview you, Gabriela. I'm really excited for our conversation tonight. How are you feeling? It's pub week. It's a big week.
It's been overwhelming and exciting and terrifying and all of the things. So excited to be talking to you. I love the affairs of the Falcons. So I'm so excited for our conversation. And yeah, it's been nuts. Yeah, just such a whirlwind, but really exciting.
Yeah, no, congratulations on making the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank
That's really
you.
incredible.
I know.
Yeah, it's a huge accomplishment. So good for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have you read a little bit later, and I'm excited to hear you read your own words, because when I read your book, I was just so moved by the fluidity with which it was written, and so I think it'll be exciting for folks to hear you read a passage from it. But just to start off, I was really captured by the 5 women that you whose story you tell in this novel. They're very strong, they're complex. Jeanette, Carmen, Maria Isabel, Maydelis, Dolores. They really are, and this is a theme throughout the book, a force of women and salt. And they come from different places, different points in history. How is it that these 5 characters came to you? And I'm interested in hearing really who came to you first.
Yeah, so I sort of knew when I started writing the book that I didn't want to write a sort of traditional Western storyline, sort of a linear narrative. I knew that I wanted to sort of jump through time and place and sort of build in all of these different voices. In terms of I think when I first started, I wasn't sure who the sort of main character or who the voice that I was sort of going to return to would be. And I wrote a lot of the pieces actually in order, even though in the book, it shifts through time. I sort of wrote a lot of the sections chronologically. And then I think, I sort of kept returning to Jeanette's voice. And maybe in part it's because that was an easier voice for me to access. She's the daughter of Cuban immigrants. We're sort of a similar age, even though we're pretty different in a lot of key ways. I think maybe that was like sort of the least challenging of some of the voices to occupy. And it sort of started to sort of coalesce around her as kind of the hinge for a lot of these different women. But you're right, like I wanted all of the characters to feel multidimensional. They're all sort of flawed in their own ways. And in many ways, I wanted to sort of write against some of the existing tropes about, for example, immigrant mothers as like these all, sacrificing, suffering, these tropes about immigrant mothers. And certainly, some of the immigrant mothers in the book do suffer and sacrifice, but they're also really complicated. Gloria at times wonders if she even wants to be a mother at certain points, or, Carmen is dealing with so many other aspects of her past and her life. So sometimes she doesn't really see her daughter. And, so I wanted them to all be sort of challenging and complex, which is difficult sometimes in writing characters because you want them to behave in a different way, or maybe they just don't do things the way you might do them. But I wanted to sort of write against those kind of one-dimensional portrayals of these characters. Mm-hmm.
Did you write them all sort of in the same period of time, or did you write them like how long did it take you to write the book, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, it took sort of like 5 years between sort of initially writing it and then, revising and editing over a few more years. I wrote the bulk of it during my MFA, which was 3 years. And the book was actually my MFA thesis before, it was published. So kind of 5 years overall. And yeah, I kind of wrote it in order. Even though, like I said, it shifts through time. I sort of kept thinking about like which characters I wanted to illuminate things about other characters, and which pieces of the narrative felt like they were missing. And so it kind of was easier for me to write it chronologically that way. Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting, because I would have thought reading it that it didn't happen that way. that it wasn't written in chronologically. And so each chapter sort of takes us to a different place and a different point in history, and they're told from different points of view. So I guess you've already kind of answered my question. You didn't so much as weave them together as they just naturally sort of took this form.
Yeah, and I think, I sort of wanted the book to feel like so much of the book is about stories, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories that other people tell us about ourselves, the sort of mythologies that we're born into, the stories that we don't have access to, but that shape our lives. So I kind of wanted the chapters to have the feel of like memories or the way that like historical knowledge works. So there are, these sort of spaces of unknowing or these kind of white spaces that exist between every chapter that sort of there's always sort of these questions in between, and there's these kind of echoes throughout these different chapters that aren't necessarily literal echoes, but historical echoes. And, I wanted the chapters to sort of speak to each other, even when they weren't necessarily literally speaking to each other. Some of these characters never meet each other. Some of them are like generations past, but I wanted to think about how some of those elements still came into those present day chapters. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one way you do that is with these two books that play a very important sort of role in connecting a couple of generations, several generations actually, Les Mis and Cecilia Valdez. Why these two books?
Yeah, so actually, those books come in one of the early chapters that takes place in the 19th century and are these books that were read to cigar workshop workers during that time. And I actually first encountered them on a trip that I took to Cuba when I went to this museum that was displaying some of these letters from Victor Hugo to independence fighters and workers during that time. And I became really fascinated by that kind of dialogue and interplay between the literary culture of the time at Cuba and, the political movements that were happening. And so, the more that I did research into these books that were being read in workshops, and also my family was always really into cigars. Like my dad really likes cigars. And so I grew up around a lot of these cigars that were, Montecristos and Romeo y Julietas. And I never knew where those names came from, which was actually like books that were really popular in the workshops during that time. So I became super fascinated by that. But also I was, the more that I encountered some of this reading material, I was thinking about the fact that, even the writings that had to do with Cuban women, it was all coming from this sort of European white male gaze or European descended white male writers in Cuba. And so, I started thinking about this character who's a woman in one of the workshops in Cuba and what it would be like to sort of find this, be sort of fascinated by this literary world that opens up for her in the workshop. And at the same time, understanding that even the perspectives that she's getting about herself are coming through this particular gaze, And so much of the book is about, like I said, stories. And, so I was thinking about whether you can like reclaim some of those words or whether that's even not possible and how that like functions throughout the generations. So those early chapters in those books felt like a kind of entryway into that larger conversation.
Yeah, and so since you touched on it a little bit, can you tell us a bit about the research that went into it? I mean, when I read the novel, I thought, oh my goodness, there's like, I could feel myself in the cigar, like working like with the cigars and making it. And you could tell that there was a lot of research that went into the aspects of this of the novel. So could you tell us what that looked like in terms of Cuba's history, and then maybe how that differed from the research that went into Gloria and Anna's story? which is very distinct from the other lineage that you talk about, and stories that you tell.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, those sort of chapters that take place in a further back history were the ones that kind of required the most. Like I did a lot of like archival research, and all of the stuff that's sort of quoted in that chapter from newspapers and books and poems, like that was all sort of real stuff that I unearthed as I was seeking out the reading material from that time. And it was a ton of work. Like I don't normally write historical fiction. That was sort of my first foray into that. And it is so much research. I have so much respect for people who write like entire books set in a distant past, because it was so much reading and looking at all of these different materials.
Did you research in like libraries or online mostly, or?
Yeah, so like there's a really good archive at the University of Miami that I relied on a lot, that has like some of these newspapers that are in that chapter, Aloud, and so forth. And like I said, some of that, stuff that was in the museum in Cuba, some of those like original letters from Victor Hugo to workers. But then sometimes it's also just like, I'd find myself writing and I'd be like, well, what were people wearing during this time? Or like, is this, it just, I kept having to go back and do more and more research, even for these like minute types of things. So it felt like a very different mode of writing than I normally am writing in. The chapters with Gloria and Ana, you're right, they're very different. And some of that takes place like in a detention center. Yeah, I mean, that was a different kind of research for me, because it's sort of, a lot of that happened before I ever became a professional writer or even started writing a book. I was a organizer for many years before I pursued my MFA, and I worked primarily on like deportation defense work. And I was working with a lot of women in detention centers and family detention centers. So I visited a few of these in Texas where this part takes place. And I was, talking to a lot of the women in the detention center, and I was talking to lawyers, and I was talking to other organizers. And so a lot of the sort of details about, the detention center, like came from that kind of personal experience. And then at times when I wasn't sure about something, like I kind of went back and talked to some of those people. But it was, I started actually writing some of the snippets of that chapter before I ever thought it was going to be a book, when I was doing that work. And it was just sort of me kind of processing the work that I was doing. But I ended up building some of that into those chapters. Mm-hmm.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting to know. I'm sorry, I'm muting myself because my children are screaming in the room next door. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's really interesting. Did you travel to Cuba as part of your research?
Yeah, I grew up, traveling to Cuba regularly, and I definitely was going back a lot during the years that I was writing the book. Actually, this has been like during the pandemic has been maybe the longest period for a long time since I've traveled to Cuba, and I'm definitely like missing it and my family there a lot. But yeah, I was traveling back there. I was talking to people in Cuba like very regularly when I was writing the book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to go back on Gloria and Anna's story, I mean, those stories felt like they could be a novel unto themselves. What compelled you to sort of put them into this novel and interlace it with Jeanette and Carmen's story?
Yeah, I think part of my impulse when I started writing the novel, I knew I wanted to set a big part of it in Miami. And I was thinking about, I wanted to really sort of write truthfully and honestly about Miami, which has always been like a really fascinating city to me, because it's one of the very few cities in the country, maybe the only one, I don't know, that's Latinx majority. city, but it's also, you know, a city that's very divided along racial lines, along class lines, even in terms of immigrant experiences are so different, depending on where you're coming from, the circumstances, and all of these different things. And so, you know, I knew that I wanted to sort of expand the book beyond just this, you know, the sort of Cuban American characters living in this kind of very privileged bubble life in Miami. And I wanted to like include more of the community in that part too. And I think, you know, I think I was also thinking a lot when I was writing this book. Like I knew I wanted the book to be all in the voices of women, and that I wanted it to be a sort of, I wouldn't even call this like a family saga, because it doesn't really go into like, I mean, first it's like 200 pages and it doesn't go into like a deep, you know, detailed history of every generation. But, you know, I was thinking a lot about the meaning of family and community. And, you know, there's these like family trees in the beginning, and they're matrilineal family trees, like they're only the women. But I was thinking about the ways that like family, you know, sometimes it's literal biological family, but it can also be like circumstantial. It can also be like these families' lives sort of come together without them even intending to. And it's complicated and it's complex. And it's, you know, it's a complicated relationship. But I wanted to sort of expand beyond just like literally only thinking about one biological family tree, and also thinking about community, and also thinking about all of these other sort of possible branches. Mm-hmm.
Maybe now would be a good time for us to hear you read.
Yeah, so I thought I would read actually from that point where these families sort of start to intersect, where you meet Jeanette and also Anna briefly. So, blue and red lights disco dancing across the walls wake her. She watches from her bedroom window. A white van with an official-looking crest. 2 agents in black jackets with reflective letters. She shrinks behind the curtain. Only a sliver of scene is visible, and the only light on the street that hasn't burned out blazes a cold glow. The letters on the jackets seem to spell out the feeling of the night. Ice. Jeanette clutches her bathrobe tight. The neighbor woman is walked out in handcuffs, wearing pajamas. On her pants, Minnie Mouse stands on tiptoe with fingers clasped at her face, hearts of varying sizes exploding in the air around her mouse ears. Jeanette doesn't know her, just knows that she works every day, even Sundays. She sees her leave her house always in the same pink smock, with the same caddy of cleaning supplies. Jeanette's breath creates little spirals of fog on the window. One agent, a woman with a burst of auburn curls, shrugs her jacket closed with one hand while the other holds the chain that links the woman's handcuffs. No shouts, no screams, no tussle. The agents and the neighbor woman walk in silence to the van, lights still spinning like 4th of July fireworks. The male agent slides the door shut with a bang. The rumble of the engine, the cloud puff of exhaust. Tiny wires crisscross all the windows, so Jeanette cannot see inside the van, cannot see the neighbor woman as the van drives down the road past every blacked out townhouse window and makes a right, disappears. It all happens in minutes.
Yeah, I have parts of that chapter highlighted in my in my version of the book. Yeah, it's incredible how she doesn't know the woman, like Jeanette, even in that moment that she doesn't know her neighbor. Yeah, I think it speaks to what you were saying earlier about class and even the ways in which division occurs in Miami within like what, what folks would assume there should be some sort of like community because you're of Latin American descent or Latin American. But that's not always the case, right? We're not the same people. And certainly those things exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a monolithic identity, and I think the idea that there's just going to be like an automatic solidarity between, there's a moment where Carmen is sort of encouraging Jeanette's mother is sort of encouraging her to call the cops about this child who's left behind when her mother is taken by ICE. And yeah, there's the sense that like there's going to be an automatic solidarity there, but these characters are so different and come from such different life experience that there isn't necessarily. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And and that I remember reading that Carmen's advice and not being surprised by it. But I can see how some folks who are outside of the community would be surprised by her telling her daughter, well, go get someone to take care of, like, because yeah, to your earlier point, like there's this idea that Latin American Latinx moms are a certain way, and that's not, when they're not all like matriarchal, crying,
Mm-hmm.
carrying a certain type of individuals, right? It's
I mean, I think it's so interesting sometimes when we talk about like the immigrant experience as if it's like one definable thing, and I feel like there's just many different immigrant experiences, based on things like race and class, and in particular, with Cuban immigrants, especially older generations who came here, just had sort of certain privileges that very few immigrants have, were automatically on a path to citizenship as long as they touched ground in the US and had all of these resources. So that's a very different immigrant experience than, someone who comes in and does not have those kinds of opportunities. So yeah, you have these characters and some of them are immigrants and they're just having very different experiences. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Carmen to me was such a complex character. I mean, to me, she, like, I guess because I felt very mixed. I had mixed feelings about her in particular. But she embodied so much for me. The lengths that one is willing to go to sort of survive emotionally from whatever generational trauma one is trying to carry, and yet at the same time she causes harm and she may not even realize it, right, to her daughter. So yeah, she was I mean, if I had to pick, she would probably be my like probably the one that I like. We talked about this a little bit over email. She'd probably be the one that I wasn't inspired by her, but I certainly I felt a lot of sympathy and empathy for her.
Yeah, I mean, she's a complicated figure because I think you're right. Like she causes harm in certain ways, or isn't even aware at times of how she's causing harm. And then also, you get glimpses into sort of an understanding of where some of her behavior is coming from, or what, it's just these characters are all sort of looking at the same situations from very different perspectives, just based on their own life experiences, and sometimes just not seeing each other, and I think that
Right.
I
think, yeah, I think the silence speaks volumes here.
Yeah, there are all of these sort of silences, and just what sort of occurs as a result of people being unable to just kind of name the thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Can you talk a little bit about how you as a poet, it's very clear in the way that you write, at least to me, me when I opened the book, it was clear that you were a poet. How did that influence the way that you approached writing a novel, and how you chose the flow? Like, how did you get into the flow of writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I love poetry. I write it, I read a lot of it. And I think a lot about, sound and rhythm and tone and style when I'm writing. And I wanted to kind of challenge myself when I was writing the book to really embody very different tones, very different styles across every chapter, and even within sometimes the same character. So like an example of that is Jeanette's kind of voice and the way the writing, the perspective in the writing, the style of the writing is really different when she's older than when she's younger. It's different, at points when she's sort of descending into this really toxic relationship and addiction, and becomes faster, and it sort of mimics some of like what's actually happening. And so I was really sort of deliberately thinking about voice and style and sound in that way. And I wanted every character to feel really distinct, every chapter to feel really distinct. And so I think some of that impulse certainly comes from the way that I think really deeply about sentences and in my poetry writing. Mm-hmm.
Did that also influence the perspective from which you were writing? Because some are in first, some are in third.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting too technical here, but I like asking about process and
yeah,
choice when it comes
I
to
love
making
craft questions. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. There are times where I thought about point of view and what it's sort of doing. If it's in first person, if it's really close to a character, is it too, is the emotion too much then? Is it like melodramatic? Does it make sense to have some distance at points that are more emotionally intense? What are the points where like that first person perspective actually provides like a necessary window? So I was sort of really thinking about point of view deliberately as I was writing it too. Mm-hmm.
And what are you working on anything? I mean, I hate asking that question when someone has literally just dropped a book, but if you are working on something or on a future work that you do plan to work on, like what are some of the themes and subjects that you hope to explore? Is it also mother-daughter relationships? Is it to continue to write about Cuba or the immigrant experience, or history? I mean, will you explore historical fiction again? I mean, it's definitely intense.
I think I'm going to take a really, really long nap after writing this book. And yeah, it's been such a struggle even during the pandemic to write, or to focus on anything. So I haven't started on a sort of longer work. I've been revising some like short stories and working on some of my poetry. But I think that, I think I'm probably always going to be really interested in relationships between women. I think that's just a thing that I'm really drawn to. And whether that's like relationships between mothers and daughters, which I think is ripe for so much exploration, but I also love relationships between sisters and friendships between women. And I think that's sort of just the territory that I'm so interested in constantly exploring. So I have no idea what the next project will actually be, but I imagine that I'm always going to be interested in those relationships.
Okay, great. I think we have a note here about the Q&A. Yes, so if you haven't yet and you have a burning question, please enter it into the Q&A. We'll be diving into that soon. Gabriela, have your parents read this book, or has anyone in your family read it? No one in my well, a couple of people in my family have read my book, and I get the phone call to be like, "Is this Tia Judy?" And I'm like, "No." But like, has anyone in your family or your friends done that?
Yeah, that's so funny because I feel like my mother always thinks everything I write is about her, even when there's like not even a mother character, or like it's just like so different, she'll still call me and be like, this is about me, isn't it? My family has, a lot of them have read it, and I gave it, to my mother to read before it was ever published, and she loves it. She had a really, incredible response to it. And I mean, the book is not autobiographical. Like there's always pieces of me in everything I write, obviously, and every character, but like I think my family knows for the most part that it's not, autobiographical. And yeah, they've been super supportive and love it, and have been excited about it. But
Yeah,
it
that's
is
cool.
terrifying.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I don't know if you have this experience, but my family, like my mom in particular, is just kind of like, oh yeah, my daughter just wrote a book. And it's just kind of like, sort of like not really, like I don't impress her at all. But it sounds like your mom is impressed by
She,
what you've accomplished.
yeah, she's been so impressed, and my entire family. Like, I had family from Cuba calling me today about the book hitting the New York Times bestseller list. So they've been really excited.
And do you think you'll go back to just writing like poetry, or will you revisit the novel?
I mean, I definitely want to write another novel. I think I will probably always write poetry. I like writing in a lot of different modes. I think I'll always write short stories. Um, yeah, I think, and I kind of like also, while I'm working on one thing, to sort of have other projects to turn to. Especially when I'm like, you know, as you know, writing a novel is so complicated, and at points where I'm like stuck or need time to think through something, I love just having another project that I can kind of turn my attention to. So I see that always being a part of my writing life.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's see. Should we go into the questions? Let's see. Let's I'm gonna try to go in order. Okay, so Lori Boone asks, what are you currently reading, or what books do you recommend?
Yeah, so I've been reading a bunch of books that are not out yet, that are coming out, but that I've been really impressed by. So I totally recommend pre-ordering them. One is Revival Season by Monica West, which I think is coming out in May. And it's just like a really sort of beautiful exploration of like family and faith, and like a Black revival church. It's really beautifully written. There's a book called Yes, Daddy by Jonathan Parks Ramage. That is, it's a sort of, it's from the perspective of like a younger gay man who enters into a relationship with an older gay man that ends up being really toxic, and is a kind of like Me Too exploration from that perspective that is really good. There's an anthology coming out called Wild Tongues Can't Be Tamed, edited by Seresier Fennell, that has really, really incredible writers, Latinx writers, and it's, some of my favorite writers in there, and highly recommend.
Yeah, she runs the Bronx's Reading Book Festival. She's great.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, I just read, in case anyone wants to know, The VA Tree Project by Nicola de Robertis, which was really excellent.
Stuff.
Yeah, it was really good. Infinite Country by Patricia Engel, and What's Mine and Yours. I mean, those are both big books that recently came out, but I enjoyed them, and I highly recommend them as well. I read poetry too, and I actually, my friend Ty Freedom Ford, her book and her collection, And More Black, is one that I always recommend because I think it's very powerful. Okay, next question. Oh, it's to me. Melissa, what did you see in, this is right, Susan Lipman. What did you see in Gabriela's book that let you know she was a poet? It's the rhythm of the opening chapter, really like the rhythm of the first few lines. I mean, but then again, but I read a lot of poetry, and there was just like a I don't want to say a swing, but like a dance almost that the words were doing, that I felt that felt to me like poetry. I don't even have an MFA, guys. So like I'm not trained to see these things. It's just something that you kind of I just kind of feel from and see from having read poetry. Okay, next question by Maria Lopez. Which of these women characters do you identify with the most, and why? That's a hard question, I would imagine.
It is, I think, because like I said, I think there are always going to be some pieces of me and all the characters that I write, but they're also so different from me, and sometimes are easier to access. Like, we talked about Jeanette just having a sort of similar subject position makes it sort of easier to access. But again, I feel like they're all pretty different from me, and sometimes they're all really complicated and sometimes just behave in ways that feel different from how I would in a situation. Or it does feel like a very, very hard question. I don't know. Yeah.
Alma de la Luz asks, what was a chapter you had a deep connection towards? Kind of a similar question to the previous one in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that also feels like really hard. That feels like like asking someone to choose between their children or something. I don't know. I felt pretty connected to like every chapter. Like maybe that's a cop out answer. I don't know. Some of them were, you know, I sort of enjoyed writing them all for different reasons. Sometimes, like I think, the chapters that take place in Cuba are written from two different perspectives. One of them is Jeanette, the Cuban American daughter of Cuban immigrants traveling to Cuba, and there's another chapter in the perspective of her cousin, who's a Cuban living in Cuba. And I think those chapters were really interesting for me to write because it was really about sort of these two characters who can't see each other. And this one character who's sort of going to Cuba with a certain expectation of what that place is going to mean to her, what it's going to illuminate for her, that sort of bucks up against the reality. And then you sort of see her from her cousin's perspective and the ways that she's sort of trying to make meaning that are like funny or weird to her cousin. And so that was like a sort of interesting exercise for me in thinking about perspective that I enjoy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, reading the Jeanette and Maydela's chapters, I felt like, oh, this is probably what my cousin thought in some ways of me when I would go over to Peru. Yeah, it was illuminating on both sides reading those two chapters.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a very common experience for like any children of immigrants sort of going back to the country where their parents, lived most of their lives, that you sort of expect it to mean something or it feels yours in some way, even if it's really not,
Yeah.
And so
it's funny how like, you have this feeling of still being an outsider, even though you're searching to like be on the inside in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, Alma also asked, I think you've answered this question. Have your family, especially your parents and grandparents, read the book? If so, what were their reactions? They were thrilled, it sounded like, which is great, as they should be.
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother.
Is it going to be translated? Do you know yet?
I don't think there's a Spanish translation yet. There are a few like others. I don't know. Maybe that'll come down the line. But yeah, I mean, my grandmother reads in Spanish, so the book is dedicated to her, but she hasn't read the book. But it was like really important to me that the dedication was in Spanish, at least, because I wanted her to be able to understand it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Amanda McTeague asks, do you have favorite books, either fiction or nonfiction, that focus on the revolutionary years in Cuba? So, meaning the years around and after the landing of the grandma?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much, particularly in literature, that has been focused on those years, So I think, my book goes into it a little bit, but I tend to be like most interested in sort of contemporary Cuba. But there are, I mean, Christina Garcia has written a lot of books that sort of take place during that time. And there's some great like anthologies. There's an anthology called like The Afro-Cuban Reader, I believe it's called, that has particularly Black Cuban experiences. There's a book that came out a few years ago called Cuba on the Verge that has, it's sort of more contemporary Cuba, but it has, it's a lot of like nonfiction writing about Cuba from a lot of very different perspectives. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think, and sorry, this is not my question. I'll go back to Q&A in a minute. Do you think you'll go back to Maria Isabel's period at all? Because that was just very vivid and very palpable to me.
Yeah, it was like I said, I don't normally write a lot of historical fiction, so I feel like it was the sort of way of challenging myself in a different writing mode. I don't know. It was a lot of work, and I think I'm probably more likely to write like a, contemporary setting in my next project, but I don't know. I'm open to it. I liked sort of challenging myself to write in all of these different modes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, how long did it take for you to know when you had collectively finished your book? How did you know you were done?
Never. Like, I don't know. Did you ever feel like you actually were done?
No. I feel like I can take out my book now and I can literally cross out and change things if I,
100%. Yeah, I think I've been really lucky to have like a lot of mentors and editors and, who've sort of been like, okay, just turn this in or send it to agents or whatever, because otherwise I think I could probably work on something for the rest of my life, so I think sometimes it can be helpful to have an outside perspective because it's so hard when it's your own work and you're so close to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you give yourself deadlines, or do you have other folks give you deadlines at all? Does that help you? Or
some of it was helpful in that I wrote a lot of the book while I was in my MFA. So like I had those sort of built-in deadlines, like I had to turn in a thesis that was a book, and then obviously like in the editorial process, once I sold the book, it was like, eventually I have to give this to my editor, otherwise they won't publish it. So yeah, I feel like I had a lot of built-in deadlines, and I think it's probably going to be harder now to sort of work on another project when I don't have those sort of built-in deadlines, and I just have to sort of self-motivate. But yeah, I'm trying to sort of teach myself to be like less. My cat wants to join in the conversation. Yeah, to sort of be, one of the things one of my mentors, like Roxane Gay, used to always talk about was like being less precious about my work and just being like, it's never going to be a perfect thing. I'm never going to feel done, and just being okay with that. Like, and I'm trying to get to that point, Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, Maria Marquez asks, what inspired you to place part of the story in Camagüey? Were you able to do research there? If you can please just elaborate on that.
Yeah, so a lot of my Cuban family is from Camagüey, which is part of my interest in that part. And then I also, I as I was doing this research and thinking about these cigar workshops, like I knew it was going to be in a sort of rural setting. And then it also had to make sense for the chapter that's set like around the time of the 1959 revolution and where that was in connection to what was happening. So Camagüey made sense for like various different reasons. And that's sort of what drew me to that particular location. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Do you let other, Gabrielle Flaxton asks, do you let other people read out loud to you what you have written to hear what it sounds like?
Oh God, I have never tried that. I don't know if I wonder what that would even be like. I have heard, I guess the closest equivalent of that would be that I've heard like the audio version of the book, which was kind of a really cool experience, to hear how somebody else sort of audio, interprets the book. Sometimes I'll read things out loud that I've written, to hear how it sounds to me. But as part of like the revision process, I've never actually tried like having somebody else read it to me. I don't even know if I would like that, to be honest. I feel like I might just like cringe or something if somebody
do you read your work aloud?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I definitely didn't like read the entire novel out loud to myself. I've heard of people doing that, but that just sounds so intense. But there are definitely like pieces of it that I've read out loud to myself just to hear how it sounds. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, I don't see any more comment and questions in the Q&A, but I think there might be some in the chat. Let me just scroll real quickly here. Questions. We answered that one. Okay. I will edit this question somewhat. Did you know sort of the story arc of each character before you started writing, or did it come as you wrote?
Yeah, so I think when I started, I had like a very different idea of how the book would end and how the sort of story would unfold. And then as I was writing, I sort of some of what I had originally thought of like didn't feel true to what was actually happening in the story, or I started to realize that I was just like interested in sort of exploring other character arcs. So yeah, it ended up going in a very different direction and actually ending in a very different way than what I had originally intended. Mm-hmm.
And what's your cat's name?
This is Rita.
Hi.
Yeah.
I wish I could have a cat. I'm allergic to them. I have a dog who is just like not as
Yeah.
fun as a cat, but
She loves being all up in every meeting, everything. So
another question. Did you have any chapters where, the men came up differently in the book than where they ended up being?
yeah, so I mean, when I wrote it out, it was very intentional to me that I wanted this book to be in women's perspectives. And, there are characters who are not women, but they're sort of always kind of and in the periphery. And yeah, some of them are terrible, some of them are just fine, but kind of just there. But I knew that I wanted to sort of just center the book around women's stories, and that I was also really interested in those relationships between women, and particular and especially when their relationships with men falter for some reason or are not fully fulfilling for some reason, like the ways that women sort of fill in those gaps for each other. And so that felt, that was sort of intentional for me.
Mm-hmm. One other question: when did you know it was a novel and not linked stories? This is from Harriet.
Yeah, so I think when I started, I was, thinking about the structure and not really sure exactly what it was going to be. Like I knew I didn't want it to be like a sort of linear chronological story, but there were points when I first started where I thought, yeah, maybe it's a linked short story collection. And then as I was writing it, there are chapters that can sort of function as standalone stories and others that don't really. And I started to add some of these pieces that didn't. And I think at some point, like I just gave myself permission to like not try to define what it was that I was writing and just sort of go, where I wanted to go and what felt right to me. And so, yeah, it's sort of, it's not, sometimes I even struggle to talk about what I'm like, it's not a family saga. It's not historical fiction. It's not really a linked, but it just kind of, it was what felt natural to me as I was writing it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and sometimes like the work itself just demands to be a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of, yeah, you can't plot it or
Yeah,
put it into
I think I
certain.
tried, in the beginning, and then
Yeah,
it just ended up being a whole different other thing,
yeah, for sure. Um, I think one final question, and we'll end here. Can you tell us how the title came to you?
Yeah, so the title is not like a literal representation of something in the book. I think like I said, I write a lot of poetry, and I think I often think about my titles the way I sort of think about them in my poetry. So like I went through the book and I was kind of looking at some of the images or the words that came up more than once. And I knew I wanted women in the title because, like I said, the book is just centered around women's voices. Salt came up a bunch of times, and then I sort of liked the emotional tone of women and salt. So it's more that than like a literal representation of something in the book.
Mhm. So it was your title, it wasn't changed to like.
Yeah, I mean, I thought of different titles, but it has been the title for a very, very long time, and it wasn't changed during the publication process.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's awesome.
Fantastic. I wish we had time to chat for another hour or two. Um, it's been such a great experience having the both of you, Melissa and Gabriela. Thank you again so much for beaming in tonight and exploring literature and history and all sorts of things. Thanks to everyone who's watching. This event is actually already archived at Litquake's Facebook page, where it's streamed live, and it will soon be on our YouTube channel as well. Don't forget to buy Gabriela's book. And while you're at it, buy Melissa's book too, please. That's why we write them. So thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time at the Litquake Epicenter. Good night, everybody.
Good night, thank you.